Sipumbe, Africa, Sipumbe,
Cape Town to Kilimanjaro, Episode 4. I was riding a GS 1200 BMW at the time because the Tenere 700 was not yet released. GS has done close to 100,000 kilometers now without missing a beat. It also contributes more essential CO2 that make plants grow better. I have no idea why there is no government subsidy for fertilizing the atmosphere, as there seems to be subsidies for everything else. After a few days I spent in Maputo, I found a sober dentist and I got going to Shashai, where I planned to stay one night before moving to Inhambane. In 2013, I travelled by road from Brisbane to Sydney to Darwin to Perth, around 9,000 kilometers. This trip will be similar in distance, but I suspect there will be a few differences. Through the outback, there were not much traffic, few people, except for some lovelies found at filling stations and truck stops. The Australian government give outback farmers first choice in meeting legal immigrant girls, whose visas allow them to work in the outback. If after 2 years she has not matched with an outback mate, she can go work or live in a city. These girls from the East were friendly and yet unaware that all men are created evil. Then there were the grey nomads, retired people who bought a camper or converted a school bus to a camper and now roam the outback. I spent many evenings at campfires listening to their stories and complaints about their kids only going to Bali and not wanting to visit them in the outback. Given the exorbitant distances and cost of civilized camping, I tried to explain to them the extreme cost disparity between a weekend to Bali or a weekend to Kings Canyon, Alice Springs or Darwin. I'm sure their children do love and miss them, but getting from Brisbane to Bourke cost more money and time than getting to Bali. Of course, there are also better bars and friendlier women in Bali, but at the time I didn't know that. Camping in the outback was either free or very expensive, but after a day or two in my own company, I felt a shower and the sight of people may be good. For this benefit, I paid up to $47. For the same price in Thailand a few weeks later, I would get a room, rent a motorcycle, eat 3 meals and get a massage. I once made the mistake of having breakfast at a small town a little east of Broome and was fined $27 for my stupidity. I protested but was shown the menu to prove it is not a fine, it is the price of power. It's like these outback people have never been anywhere else. They don't realize that in fact they are the reason hardly any Australian ever visits the outback, or the sticks as they call it. As for myself, I really enjoyed the trip and I can hardly wait to go back to Australia. It's 192nd on my list of countries to visit. In Thailand, $27 would exchange to bed and breakfast at a hotel in Phuket, free internet and $7 change. But today I have none of these first world problems. Unlike the outback, the route from Maputo was congested, but has since been upgraded by the Chinese. Americans will say this is bad, but I confess less potholes, traffic and chickens crossing the road is not an obvious detriment. Shai was a beehive of activity, and I booked in at a smallish hotel in the main street. I went for lunch at a restaurant which was splendidly catered, almost like a French oil rig on Sundays. Minutes later, the restaurant was flooded with fancy-dressed government officials, seating themselves at reserved tables, but eventually also at my table. I had the privilege to lunch with the Minister of Mining and Energy, who spoke passable English and proceeded to converse with me about history, economics, politics and communism. It's possible my enquiry as to the street names in Maputo may have energized him, as he explained that they are comrades of communism and disciples of Mao Zedong. I assume that he does not know what Mao did to the Chinese and felt no compunction to argue his sovereign right to a favored political system. As I was living in Australia at the time and painfully aware of the civilized corruption driving the cost of living, I could not with a straight face commend a system where housing is 10 times more expensive than in South Africa and 40 times more expensive than in Mozambique. Although, at second thought, the semi-socialist government of Australia and the communist government in Mozambique has more in common than meets the eye. In Perth, for instance, the price of storing my car in a tin shack for a month was more expensive than my accommodation in a Thailand hotel for the same period. I would discover the reason parking is so expensive this side of the road is because the pristine nothingness on the other side is protected by government fiat. They arbitrarily create scarcity of land by outlawing the use of 90% of their own country. The price for an undeveloped stand on the one side of the street may be $300,000, 3 times the average house price in South Africa, while the other side of the street is the start of 1,000 kilometers of nothing. But you cannot build a house there. Why? Because your benevolent, all-knowing, sovereign government say so.